Red Bull. From Vettel domination, Multi-21, Daniel Ricciardo, Maxi Taxi domination, countless driver swaps, but now nothing. This time round, Jaguar has dissolved as a team and no one has bought them out, leading to 6 constructor titles now up for grabs. And in these seasons, I'm going to go ahead and look at all the differences that would be made if Red Bull were never in F1 and see just how much the championships change. Now, quick side note before we start this video is purely for fun. I do understand that with Red Bull out of the sport, the races wouldn't have gone exactly how they would have gone, just getting rid of their results. However, with the data we have, this is all we can do. Otherwise, it would very much just become a case of, oh, I think they would have done better because they're a better driver, etc. And then very similar to Racing Bulls, I will be keeping Racing Bulls, Toro Rosso, V-Carb, whatever they are in that season, purely because they don't change that much, but again, they probably wouldn't have been in the sport if Red Bull won as well. However, this is the best scenario we could do to figure out exactly how different F1 would be. So I hope you enjoy. Let's get straight into it. Now, quickly before I actually talk about those 6 constructor title seasons, I will go over some key seasons from Red Bull where they didn't actually win the constructors and see if there's any changes. As Red Bull came in 2005, and they have had quite a bit of an effect on the F1 history so far. One season you wouldn't actually think they had an effect, but they actually did, is 2007. Now, Red Bull actually had a brilliant European Grand Prix, meaning they got 10 points throughout that weekend. However, someone who was behind both the Red Bull drivers was Lewis Hamilton, which now means with those extra 2 points Lewis Hamilton gets from taking the spots from Red Bull, Lewis Hamilton now becomes a rookie drivers world champion by a single point. Now in 2016, nothing actually changes. However, Rosberg's gap actually increases as Rosberg goes up to 411 points to Hamilton on 393. 2021, where Lewis Hamilton would now win by a landslide, now taking his 9th championship before we've even properly started this video. And then finally in 2024, of course, we had to mention this season. This was a very close battle between Ferrari and McLaren, and hey, it was even close between Norris and Leclerc by the end of things. So does anything change with Red Bull out of the way? Well, Lando Norris gains 58 points to Leclerc's 56, so Lando Norris would actually take the crown in 2024. Maybe that will soften the blow of not doing too well in 2025 in this sort of alternate universe. And then constructor-wise, McLaren would gain 106 points to Ferrari's 115, so it would actually get even closer than before, with Ferrari on 767 points to McLaren's 772, only a 5-point difference. However, McLaren would still end up taking their Constructors title that they won in 2024. But now let's get into the seasons where they won the Constructors Championship. So we head back all the way to the start of the 2010 Vettel domination. If you weren't watching the sport at the time, it was Vettel, Vettel, Vettel. He was the star boy. And constructor-wise for this first season, it actually is quite clear-cut who wins it. And that is McLaren Mercedes. As Ferrari, they looked pretty good this season. However, Felipe Massa sort of let the side down, and the consistency of Hamilton and Button would be enough to secure their constructors title. However, now this big title fight came down to Hamilton versus Alonso. And funnily enough, they would actually both gain 44 points. So after all that, Alonso would now take 2010 Drivers' Championship. Now, in a very similar fashion, in 2011, we have another Ferrari versus McLaren fight. And again, the same sort of situation happens, as the consistency of both Hamilton and Button are enough to keep Ferrari at bay, winning another Constructors' title. However, now instead of Hamilton versus Alonso, it is now Jenson Button versus Alonso. And with Jenson Button securing an extra 77 points to Fernando Alonso's extra 74, it now means that Jenson Button is a double world champion, ending the season with 347 points to Fernando Alonso on 331. Now, for the first time in this Red Bull scenario, we actually have a clear-cut Drivers' Championship winner, and that of course is Fernando Alonso, because he was battling with Sebastian Vettel the entire season. Getting rid of Vettel means there was only going to be one winner. However, the Constructors is a complete different story. As again, it's another Ferrari versus McLaren. However, there was only a 22-point difference between the two teams. However, sadly for any McLaren fans, McLaren only managed to gain 58 points to Ferrari's 88, meaning that Ferrari would actually have quite a sizable gap come the end of the season, with 488 to McLaren's 436. Then shooting off into the final season of Vettel domination, we again have quite a clear-cut Drivers' Championship winner, and it is again Fernando Alonso. He really does love these early 10s if Red Bull wasn't here, meaning that with this title, he now takes home his 5th Drivers' Championship. However, instead of the normal Ferrari versus McLaren, it is now Ferrari versus Mercedes for that top spot. And oh my god, did it get close. As normally, Mercedes just about beat Ferrari, separated by 6 points on 360 to 354. But now with the balls out of the way, Ferrari would gain 126 points to Mercedes 121. Just not enough for Ferrari to gain that Constructors title, which means now Mercedes would win their first extra Constructors title, really setting the precedent for what was about to come. And then we have to take a big old jump, basically completely miss the Mercedes domination as nothing would change with Red Bull out of the way for the Drivers' or Constructors' Championship, all the way to the new regulations in 2022. And this just feels so crazy to say, but I think we know already who the Drivers' Champion will be, and it's another clear-cut winner for Ferrari. Charles Leclerc, 3 years ago, would have been a Drivers' World Champion. Of course, his closest rivals were Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez, so he would actually absolutely dominate this season. However, again, which we've seen quite a lot, when there's not a driver's fight or a constructor's fight, the other will have the entertainment for us. And that is exactly what happened, as originally, Mercedes and Ferrari were separated with 39 points, with Ferrari being the second place constructor. However, this time round, Mercedes gained 176 points to Ferrari's 151. Whew! It now meant that there was only a 14-point gap between the constructor winner of Ferrari. So Ferrari do end up getting that Constructors title, but wow, did they cut it close. With Ferrari ending on 705 to Mercedes 691. And now heading into the final season of this scenario, this one probably was the most fun to do, however definitely the most tedious, as we basically had a 5-way battle for the championship, as if you get rid of Perez and Verstappen, basically all of the wins are up for grabs bar Singapore. So a lot of things change. So we'll start off with the constructors, and with Red Bull out of the way, it now actually means Mercedes come in to take the crown with 574 points to their name to Ferrari's 571. Another time where Mercedes and Ferrari are super close and they've come out on top. 1 point in 2013 and then 10 years later it's 3 points in 2023. And to keep on this Mercedes hype train that they had made, it now means Lewis Hamilton would take another driver's title in this scenario, now up to his 10th, with 329 points as he gained an extra 95. To Alonso in second place. Yep, that Aston Martin held on for quite a while with 319, so it was very close between those two. Third place to Leclerc with 290, Lando Norris in fourth with 287, and Carlos Sainz with 281 in fifth, with George Russell quite far behind, but with 245. So the first season in 2007, Lewis Hamilton was the one who won the most. And then coming to the end in 2023, it is the exact same story again. So, in summary, from Red Bull Racing not being involved with Formula 1, here is everything that changed. Hamilton now becomes a 10-time world champion, and I honestly think in this alternate universe, no one could ever beat 10 titles. That is just an incredible feat. Lando Norris now becomes a Drivers' World Champion in 2024. McLaren gain an extra 2 constructor titles to their name, now in the double digits with 11. Alonso now becomes a 5-time world champ, the same as Fangio. Jenson Button gains an extra title, going up to 2 to his name. Ferrari gain an extra 2 titles, now on 18. Mercedes also gain another 2, now again into the double digits with 10. And finally, probably the craziest one is Charles Leclerc now becomes a Drivers' Champion, winning in 2022. So, now the only question I have to ask you is, was it worth taking Red Bull out to get all of these different scenarios? I have a feeling if you're a Lewis Hamilton fan, a McLaren fan, or a Ferrari fan, you are very much going to be loving this situation. However, Vettel and Verstappen fans, you might have to winch your eyes at looking at some of those stats. However, thank you all so much for watching. This is just a fun video. I know it's not too serious. Of course, you physically can't figure out exactly where everyone would be, because a lot of these races, you just take them out of their positions. So of course, the fighting would be different, the strategies would be different, but this is the best we're going to get. And at the end of the day, it's just good fun. But anyway, if you like what you saw, like and subscribe. Comment down below how you feel about all of these stats, and I will be seeing you all for my Everything You Need to Know video on Wednesday. Take care.